The Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. Today's hearing is entitled An Overview of Homelessness in America. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of this subcommittee may participate in today's hearing for the purpose of making an opening statement and questioning witnesses. The chair now recognizes himself for a 5-minute opening statement. I first want to thank our witnesses for participating in today's hearing as we take a look at homelessness in America. We also need to review the effectiveness and efficiency of our federal programs in order to determine if we are getting the biggest bang for our taxpayer dollar. We've already had an opportunity to discuss a number of ways HUD helps the poorest among us climb out of poverty and achieve self-sufficiency, whether through the FSS program, housing choice vouchers, or rental assistance. Each year, I host a homelessness and hunger summit in my district. This year, I was honored to be joined by the HUD Secretary Ben Carson at our event, where we had over 400 people in attendance. Maybe the HUD Secretary brings a few more people out. That was nice. But during that summit, we learned that time and again, homelessness in rural areas looks a lot different than homelessness in urban areas. But I would just note that it has the same impact on individuals and on families all the same. I'm sure you'll understand my focus on Wisconsin, and I want to quote something from Ms. Bremer's testimony that highlights the distinction between homelessness in rural areas versus urban areas. Now, before reading her quote, I would just note that PIT in HUD speak is point in time and refers to how many people are counted as homeless in an area on a specific day. So, to quote Ms. Bremer, comparing January 2016 PIT to the January 2017 total, there was an overall 12% decrease in the number of people experiencing homelessness on that one night in Wisconsin. However, there was an 8% increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness in our rural communities, end quote. So, we have statewide homelessness in Wisconsin going down by 12%, but rural homelessness actually increasing, which is a significant problem. Now, I like Madison and Milwaukee as much as any other Wisconsinite, but we need to make sure that HUD's resources aren't just primarily focused on metropolitan areas. That means addressing some of the funding disparities between rural and urban populations. The 2010 Census Bureau's Consolidated Federal Funds Report stated that of all federal government assistance provided per capita, folks in rural communities receive almost $700 less per year than in urban communities. That's a lot of money, especially for our smaller providers who are helping the homeless. We can start by looking at the federal definition of homelessness to be more inclusive and recognize the reality that the homeless population in rural areas face different challenges than the homeless in larger, more metropolitan areas. Our homeless in rural Wisconsin, we don't have bridges that the homeless sleep under, or large centers providing shelter. Our local communities don't get funding proportionate to that of larger cities. The homeless in my district hope that they have a friend that'll put them up for a night on their couch, or they live out of their cars. This might shock some of you, but some of my constituents actually will sleep in the woods when they don't have a place to stay. We don't even have sidewalks in some of our rural communities. This is rural stuff. So let me close by saying this. As it turns out, folks aren't happy when they're relying on the government. People are happy when they're in the community, in the workforce, contributing to society, and at the end of the day, they have a bit of cash left over, maybe to spend on themselves or their families. And so I want to make sure that our programs achieve those goals. To quote Secretary Carson, quote, "We should measure the success of a program not on the number of people we add to it, but the number of people we get off of it," end quote. And so today's hearing, I know that Ms. Waters is going to testify, and I know that in California, in LA, there's a serious homelessness problem that's ravaging her community. And so I don't, in my comments, want to undermine the problems that we have across the country, but I do think it's a point in time where we can talk about the disparity of rural America and how homelessness affects our people in a different way, and how the funding resources don't flow to rural America, though the impact on a family and an individual are just as catastrophic. So again, I want to thank our panelists for being here today. I look forward to your insight and your feedback. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing. I associate myself with the facts that you just presented. In Missouri, 5 out of every 10,000 people are homeless, and one of the great tragedies is that many Vietnam veterans live along the Missouri River, and that's quite a jump. Usually, we'll have this annual stand down where we try to bring as many of them in to the city for haircuts and dental checks and so forth. But they live along the Missouri River, and that's significant when you consider that it's the 3rd longest river system in the world. The Missouri connects up with the Mississippi, and just outside of Kansas City, headed towards St. Louis. And they're living all along the river part, and a significant number of them live outside of a place called Slater that you've never heard of, and maybe you've heard of Marshall. It's 12,000 people. So we have a very serious problem. It's being addressed by some great agencies, City Union Mission in Kansas City, Restart in Kansas City. But when you get into the rural areas, there are very, very few, if any, homeless shelters. Now, we can say what we want about people who are homeless, but for many of them, they are people with some severe issues, some of them mental. One of the most painful days for my twin sons was when the local newspaper reported that Willie Mays Aikens was living under a bridge in Kansas City. Willie Mays Aikens, for 5 years, was the leading home run hitter for the Kansas City Royals. And he ended up living under a bridge. And there are a million stories like that all along the Missouri River. So thank you for calling this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and hopefully we'll get some answers to give us help. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you, say a thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm very pleased that we're having this hearing. Some of us have been calling on this committee to turn its attention to homelessness for more than 5 years. And of course, this will be the first hearing that this committee has focused on homelessness during our chairman's tenure. And I certainly hope it will not be the last. In fact, I would like to remind the chairman of my request to hold a field hearing in Los Angeles to hear from local stakeholders about the recent increase in homelessness in that area. Los Angeles is ground zero for homelessness, and that's why I'm pleased that Peter Lynn is here today to tell us about the unique experience of Los Angeles and unique challenges and solutions that they're facing in fighting this problem. Today, there are over 500,000 people experiencing homelessness here in the richest country in the world, over 1/5 of whom are children. These are veterans who we failed to support when they returned home after serving our country. These are women fleeing domestic violence. These are people who have left prison after serving their debt to society. And these are people who have simply fallen on hard times. Mr. Chairman, we know exactly how to end a person's homelessness. You provide her with a home. That is why I introduced H.R. 2076, a $13.2 billion bill, the Ending Homelessness Act, which provides a surge of new resources and a comprehensive plan to tackle this solvable problem. The end of homelessness in this country is within our reach if we can just muster the political courage to provide the necessary resources. Mr. Duffy, let me just say this. I don't think there is any division, any problems talking about homelessness, both in rural and urban areas. Everybody wants to do something about this. And I can tell you that I support dealing with and supplying the resources for homelessness in the rural community, just as I support it in the urban community. So I'm anxious that we can get along with doing something about homelessness. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back, and I look forward to working with her on this very important issue. I think I've actually suggested coming to California and letting her come to rural Wisconsin. It would be a fun trip together. But that's for a different conversation. She said she's going to go to Los Angeles, not to Wisconsin. I would know it. I want to welcome our witnesses today. Thank you for being here. First, I want to recognize our first witness, Ms. Nan Roman, the president of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, also one who has participated in my homelessness and hunger summits in Wisconsin, and I appreciate that. Our second witness is Duana Bremer, the Social Service Director for Polk, Burnett, and St. Croix counties at the Salvation Army, counties that belong to the 7th District of the great state of Wisconsin. From personal experience, I just know how hard she works and the success she's had helping the poorest among us work through her programs and transition into a life of sustainability. And she's also been part of our homelessness and hunger summits, and I thank her for being here today as well. Our third witness is Mr. Peter Lynn, Executive Director of the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority. Welcome. And for the introduction of Ms. Bischoff, I want to look to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, for her introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you for calling this hearing and your impactful opening statement. I'm honored to introduce Ann Bischoff, the CEO of the Star House. It's a 24-hour center that provides services for homeless youth in Central Ohio. I've had the opportunity to visit Star House and witness firsthand how impactful their work is on the vulnerable youth population that they serve, and is committed to serving her fellow man. And I want to welcome her to the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee of the Financial Services Committee, and thank you for allowing me to introduce her. Thanks for being here, Ann, and we're looking forward to hearing your very important testimony on how this impacts youth, because the statutory definition also leaves them out. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stivers. The witnesses will now be, in a moment, recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of their written testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record following their oral remarks. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask the panel questions. I would just note that on your table, there are 3 lights. Green means go, yellow means you have 1 minute left, and red means that your time is up. Pretty self-explanatory. The microphones are sensitive, so please make sure you're speaking directly into them. With that, Ms. Roman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your written testimony. You need a microphone, is it on?
Yes.
There we go.
Better. Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Cleaver, and members of the subcommittee and the committee, thank you so much for inviting the National Alliance to End Homelessness to testify at this important hearing. I know personally of the tremendous commitment of Chairman Duffy and Ranking Members Cleaver and Waters, Congressman Royce, and many other members of the subcommittee to helping to end homelessness, and we're deeply grateful for your leadership. I'm pleased to report to you that although homelessness didn't go down in every community, from 2007 to 2016, homelessness did decline in the nation across all measured populations, and this has happened despite the headwinds of increasing rents and declining incomes for poor people. It happened because of federal support, notably from the McKinney-Vento homeless assistance programs, and because of the effective work of local leaders like those who joined me here today on the panel. Progress has been made, but there's a long way to go. Over 550,000 people are homeless every night. This is unnecessary because we know how to end homelessness, and achieving that goal is well within our ability as a nation. People become homeless when they lose housing, and people who have a home are not homeless. It's definitional. You here on the subcommittee do not control every federal resource that might be able to help people end their homelessness, but you do control housing resources and the homeless programs. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's homeless assistance programs have been effective and successful. They are effective because they know what they can do and what they cannot do. They can help people resolve a housing crisis and end their homelessness. They cannot solve every problem that people have or end their poverty on their own. They're a first step. They're effective because they focus on housing. They're effective because they collect and use data. And they are effective because as HUD learns from the field about what works best, it continually adjusts the programs to support those solutions and maintains a firm focus on outcomes. As a taxpayer, I would say that is how I want a federal program to run. The programs are effective, but there are always things that could be improved. The programs have become more complex, and there may be ways in which they could be streamlined. It must be said, though, that a lot of the complexity has to do with stretching an inadequate resource to try to meet urgent needs. While homelessness has declined more rapidly in rural than urban areas overall, sorry, that's not the case in Wisconsin, the programs could do a better job of helping rural areas take advantage of their smaller homeless numbers. The subcommittee might consider allowing rural communities to provide short-term emergency lodging assistance, incentive payments to host households, and encouragement to counties to combine homeless and mainstream funding. Also, to use a different definition that's more flexible with respect to the things you discussed in terms of people, there are no shelters. It's harder to identify homeless people as being homeless. People who are homeless must have housing, but they also have service needs. HUD needs to partner with other federal agencies in terms of the federal responsibility for that, and that is where the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness comes in. It helps federal agencies and state and local entities to coordinate. The impact of USICH's work can be seen in the positive homelessness outcomes. The Alliance wholeheartedly supports the work of USICH and its continuing authorization, which could be accomplished through H.R. 5393, the Working Together to End Homelessness Act. While there are always things to improve, it makes sense not to change things that are working well. Using permanent supportive housing to end chronic homelessness has cut that population in half. HUD could be more aggressive in targeting turnover vouchers to move on initiatives that would free up more of the supply of that for higher need people. Rapid rehousing has significantly contributed to the reduction in family homelessness. This intervention should be expanded, especially for use by individuals. HUD's investment in new youth programs fills an unmet need. It will be important as the demonstrations begin to be implemented to monitor their outcomes and see what works. There needs to be an articulation of solutions to homelessness among individuals. The largest subpopulation, this is the largest subpopulation, but it's been the least attended to by communities and by HUD, which is possibly the reason that unsheltered homelessness has gone up. These are some of the things to continue in next steps, but again, it's the Alliance's view that with the strong leadership and support of Congress and the administration, and with a strict focus on outcomes, the McKinney-Vento programs are doing an excellent job. Two very important things, however, remain to be said. At least a third of people who are homeless are unsheltered, nearly 200,000 people a night. That means they have no roof over their head at all. That is just not acceptable. HUD is doing the best it can. It and all its grantees are wringing every possible ounce out of every dollar they get from you and leverage from others. We know what to do to get people back into housing, but we just don't have the money to do it for those people who are unsheltered. Further, more people are going to become homeless, and the effectiveness of our homeless efforts are going to diminish if the trajectory doesn't change on affordable housing. That problem is just getting worse. Lower income families and individuals are paying more and more of their inadequate incomes for rent, and they are being placed at risk of homelessness. Not addressing that crisis will stop our progress on ending homelessness and have enormous economic, social, and human cost to our nation. Once again, I thank you so much for having this hearing and for inviting the Alliance to be here.
Thank you, Ms. Roman. Ms. Bremer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, I would like to thank Chairman Duffy, the Ranking Member Cleaver, and the rest of the committee for allowing us to be here today to address this very important issue. Salvation Army is very grateful to be part of this conversation to help homeless families seek permanent housing. Homelessness is often framed as an urban policy issue. However, families, service providers, and communities, this situation has received little notice from media or research attention because it's mostly focused on the highly visible problem of urban homelessness. There are over 554,000 homeless individuals residing in the country today. 7% of those individuals are from rural communities. Rural residents have had a long tradition of taking care of their own, with reliance on relatives, friends, and neighbors. In any way, this has been effectively disguising the numbers of rural homelessness in our community. Homelessness in rural areas, you don't see them. They're not on the streets. We don't see them in our communities. They're in woods, they're in barns, they're doubled up with friends, they're in storage units. Since homeless individuals are hidden like this, it is very difficult to count them. So when we do have our point-in-time street count, and we count people that are literally on the streets or in a shelter, many of these folks go uncounted because we don't know where they are. Because rural homelessness manifests itself differently from urban areas, the difference may be that we need to look at policy changes that are a little bit different for a rural area compared to an urban area. The rural homeless population make up more families and fewer single individuals. These individuals in many cases are working as well, and many of them are experiencing homelessness for the very first time. What causes some of this housing instability? It's obviously the loss of affordable housing. Wages in rural areas many times have not kept up with the cost of living. People are underemployed, and the debt to Americans have taken on a great deal for this issue. The other issue in rural areas that we see a lot is the deinstitutionalization of mental health. Without giving enough community-based housing to assist these folks. Approaches to address homelessness have also changed over the years. Well, in the past, many of the approaches used to deal with homelessness were getting people simply off the streets and putting them into an emergency shelter. Today, with the Continuum of Cares, which are COCs, they work to transition homeless people into permanent housing solutions. Now, permanent housing solutions may be different for everyone. Permanent solution might be for someone a group home. It might be a rest home. It might be sharing an apartment with someone else. They are all different for every individual. COCs are geographically based entities created by HUD that are tracked with transitioning people that are transitioning the homeless population into the area through a range of services ultimately set up to meet their needs. A COC may offer outreach and intake. It may link people to appropriate housing services. It may provide transitional supportive housing. It may put people into permanent supportive housing. There are also many significant barriers in rural areas that are different than urban. One is the lack of transportation. There is very limited, no public transportation in rural communities. So how do you get to a service provider when you don't have a car? Isolation, that's another issue in rural areas. People are so isolated due to the expansiveness of our area that they find it emotionally cut off as well as geographically cut off. There is a shortage of services in rural areas because our populations and our areas are not quite as large. And again, there are barriers to employment which indicate transportation issues. In closing, since the Interagency Council on Homelessness has a goal of ending homelessness in America by 2020, I feel that it's important that we consider how the rural population of individuals and families experiencing homelessness may need different policy solutions and practice models other than those living in urban areas. We want to ensure individuals and families experiencing homelessness, they are considered as possibly a special population with unique barriers and needs. The federal policies could be tailored and, when possible, flexible in order to make sure rural communities can meet the needs of residents who experience homelessness in rural areas. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lynn for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Cleaver, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Peter Lynn. I represent the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which is a joint powers authority between the city and county of Los Angeles. We are the lead for the continuum of care, and we administer federal, state, and local assistance countywide. That includes programs focusing on prevention, on outreach, on shelter and emergency crisis and bridge housing, as well as permanent housing outcomes for folks, including short-term rental assistance like the Rapid Housing Program that Nan mentioned, permanent supportive housing programs that include durable rental subsidies. We coordinate our work with many other partners, public and private, through Los Angeles's coordinated entry system. It's a very effective, collaborative, strategic planning mechanism and assessment tool, backbone of infrastructure to align all of the services we're delivering into homelessness. Our jurisdiction covers densely urban areas like the city of Los Angeles. It includes suburban communities like those in the San Gabriel Valley, and it includes rural areas like those in the high desert up in the Antelope Valley. Homelessness in Los Angeles is at crisis proportions. Last year, the number of people homeless in LA rose 23%, almost 58,000 Angelenos homeless on any given night in 2017. LA's numbers were enough to impact the national picture last year. And in LA, unlike the rest of the nation, our numbers are actually worse from an unsheltered perspective. 3/4 of Angelenos experiencing homelessness are unsheltered. They are living in vehicles, they are living in tents, they are living in makeshift dwellings that are visible throughout the Los Angeles County. Our ability, like others doing this work nationally, our ability to actually effectively address the homelessness of any given person that we can serve is actually increasing every year. We have more programming, and the effectiveness of our programming has gotten better and better. We're moving more people into housing year over year. In 2016, we moved over 14,000 people out of a state of homelessness into permanent housing. That is an increase of 30% over the year before that, 61% over the year before that. We project those numbers to increase as we deploy new local resources. Angelenos have voted to tax themselves, actually twice. There was a county-wide sales tax measure, putting $0.25 new revenues for homelessness, and a City of LA bond measure to put $1.2 billion into new permanent supportive housing capital. But the root cause of the crisis in Los Angeles is not the homeless crisis system. It is housing affordability. Our main challenge is that we are one of the least affordable housing markets in America. By many metrics, we have one of the lowest vacancy rates, we have one of the highest numbers of people paying more than half their income for rent. Los Angeles, there are 700,000 renter households paying more than 50% of their income for rent. Of those, more than 300,000 of those households make under $20,000 a year. This is a very high-cost region. There's an enormous number of families that are absolutely on the edge of homelessness. They are one financial crisis, one car payment, one medical bill away from homelessness in Los Angeles. Nationally, it's estimated that fewer than 25% of households that are income eligible for a deeply affordable housing programs have access to these programs. In Los Angeles, 16% of those very low-income households are subsidized. We have a crisis of affordability in LA. Most people face homelessness due to the numbers we see for economic reasons. That's the primary cause of homelessness for the people that we speak to. There are other drivers. History of incarceration is one of the primary drivers, has an impact on people's economic stability and their ability to rent in the housing market. Inequitable criminal justice enforcement has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color in Los Angeles and nationally. This is why the representation of African Americans in homelessness is very disproportionate to the representation of other communities. That's one of the issues that we have to address in addressing homelessness nationally. We need to fund more affordable housing, both workforce and low income, and we need to fully fund the programs that address homelessness. As Nan pointed out, we know how to use the resources. We have been effective in reducing homelessness nationally, even though these programs have not increased their funding markedly. We want to encourage you to support the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. It has been an extremely effective partner in bringing together federal collaboration, partners that, for all their willingness, have not been the best at collaborating across agencies. We also think that their expertise at bringing information to local communities is unparalleled. They are one of the main drivers of the success of bringing information to those communities. Also want to just thank the subcommittee for looking into this issue. It is a critical one for Los Angeles and for the nation. We greatly appreciate your focus on homelessness.
Thank you, Mr. Lin. Ms. Bischoff, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Duffy and Ranking Member Cleaver, members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be here today to recognize and state the unique needs of youth who are living without permanent housing in our communities. My name is Ann Bischoff, and I'm CEO of Star House. We're a drop-in center for youth ages 14 to 24 who are experiencing homelessness in Central Ohio. My testimony today is from the perspective of a drop-in center that is operating in collaboration with HUD, but outside of the HUD system. We use the McKinney-Vento Education Act definition of homelessness, which includes youth who are without a permanent place to call home, including those who are living with another person due to hardship. They're called couch surfers. My oral testimony today is condensed to 3 points. Number 1, youth homelessness is complex and growing. Number 2, there are proven practices within the drop-in center model. And number 3, I'd like to share some innovative ideas for addressing the workforce and housing needs of youth. A recent research study by Chapin Hall, this is an institute with the University of Chicago, found that over a 12-month period, 1 in 30 13 to 17-year-olds were experiencing homelessness. The number was 1 in 10 for youth ages 18 to 25. This equates to about 3.5 million young people, and 3/4 of these young people slept on the streets and were also couch surfing. More than half of these youth felt unsafe in these situations, and they were at high risk of exploitation. In fact, nationally, 1 in 5 of these youth have experienced human trafficking. Couch surfers are not currently eligible for HUD services because they do not meet the HUD definition of homelessness. And here are some things that we've learned at Star House. We know that half of youth living on the streets experiencing homelessness have been in foster care, 1/4 have aged out of care. So this tells us that they likely have no mom or dad there to support them during these crucial transition years to adulthood. Jewish Family Services in Central Ohio works with both Holocaust survivors and young people aging out of foster care. And they've told me that in a survey of youth aging out of care, they're scoring 8.5 on a 10-point scale of trauma. And the ACEs scale includes experiences like rape, abuse, assault, and so on. Given what they know about Holocaust survivors, they're telling us that a score of 8.5 on average for these youth is equivalent to the experience of a Holocaust survivor. 41% have attempted suicide. This tells us that when you're not sure where you're going to be sleeping from night to night, your hope for the future is diminished. We know that 1/4 to 40% of these young people, depending on when you survey, identify as LGBTQ, and they've been ostracized from their families. According to Chapin Hall, LGBTQ youth were more than twice as likely to report homelessness. What all these statistics boil down to is trust. These are young people who were let down by the adults in their lives who were supposed to be there to love and support them. As a result, they would too often rather fend for themselves on the streets than reach out for help. In fact, our research at Star House tells us that 80% of these young people will choose a drop-in center over the adult shelter system for fear of being abused, victimized by the older adults there. We know the story of a young man at Star House who ran away from an abusive situation at home, got a job at the mall, and slept behind a dumpster on an inflatable pool raft there just so he could get to work on time. He found Star House and was able to get a shower, a hot meal, and some other resources that he needed. He kept his job as a result, and he was able to move on and didn't need our services as long as others. The story of another young woman is that she was living in an abandoned home and nailing wooden planks in the door each night just so she could get enough peace to sleep at night. She was physically and sexually abused by her parents. So the drop-in center model works because these young people have immediate access to basic needs. We work very hard to build their trust and to connect them with on-site resources like therapy, shelter, healthcare. This is a population that's 12 times more likely to die than their peers, and we work hard to connect them with housing, education, workforce development, and other resources. Last year, we served 1,000 individuals, up from 400 in 2012. Our research shows that the longer young people experience the transience of homelessness by any definition, the more difficult it becomes for them to exit street life. Utilizing the McKinney-Vento Education Act definition, which includes couch surfers, allows us to assist all youth living without a permanent place to call home before they become chronically homeless. A couple of innovative ideas for addressing the workforce and housing needs of youth. One, we know that 60% of youth, after coming to Star House, acquired a job. And when you ask the same youth if they still have the job, it's nearly 40%. So providing flexible jobs on site at Star House will be a life changer for them. They'll be able to access workforce development on their own schedule and be more likely to attain a permanent job once they secure housing. Thank you for inviting me to share with you today. Youth homelessness is growing, and research tells us that the longer young people experience homelessness, they're more likely to, the harder it becomes for them to exit street life. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Bischoff. And I want to thank the panel for their statements. The chair now recognizes himself 4 or 5 minutes for questions. I want to thank the panel again. I think we've done a nice job of getting a wide array of opinions and views from across the country, and frankly, riveting and insightful testimony, so thank you for that. Ms. Bremer, I want to turn to you first. Obviously, we share the same area, western, northern, rural Wisconsin. If you were to leave us with one point on how we can help you serve your community better, what changes can we make that would help you the most?
I think the one change that we could make would be to have more flexibility in the HUD definition. And I can give you an example of this. I am part of the West Central COC, which is in your district. We have a very large population of chronically homeless in that area. We have also a large population of homeless. That particular area, we really want to follow the HUD definition of homelessness so we can serve the most vulnerable. I also work in another county, Burnett County, which is extremely rural. They have 0 chronic homelessness, but they have 20 children in their schools that are unaccompanied youth that I'm not able to help with the HUD definition. These are kids that are sofa surfing, they have no permanent house, they're sleeping at Walmart, they're going to the Quick Trip, but I would like to be able to work with those folks to get them into permanent housing. So I think the main thing would be flexibility.
Flexibility, okay. I want to quickly ask you about the rapid rehousing program and your concern with being able to take a few more dollars for case management. Is that correct, number one? And number two, why?
This is what we're looking at. With HUD dollars that we receive, permanent supportive housing folks are the folks that have the greatest barriers. They receive a lot of case management, and to be honest with you, because they have been homeless for many years in some cases, they have also mental health and AODA issues. They need a lot of case management, and I think we're serving that population very well. There is another segment of population that walks into our office. Basically, they hit a little bump in the road, and all they need is some rent assistance, and they can be on their way. Those folks are succeeding and doing very well. It's the group in the middle that really don't qualify for extensive permanent supportive housing support, but they need more than no case management at all. So working with these clients, I think we can work with them and use funding more efficiently to move them into independence quicker, to be able to also work with the schools, go to conferences, and just move forward with their families.
And I want to thank you for bringing up the issue of transportation. Again, we don't have public transportation. You don't have a car that works very well. It breaks down. You can't get to your job. You lose your job. Then you lose your house. And if we could figure out a way how we could get reliable transportation, and we've talked about this in the past, but it's a longer conversation, more thoughtful on how we get resources to help people out or how we partner with community members to make this happen. This could deal with the critical issue that we have in our rural community. Ms. Bishop, I want to turn to you quickly. I'm not sure, as you're speaking about foster care, I'm sure you know of Congressman Mike Turner's bill that we had a hearing on recently that will bridge our kids coming from foster care to make sure they have housing. The stats are stunning that kids who come out of foster care and the rates of homelessness. Have you worked with Mr. Turner in this legislation? Because you're like singing off the same sheet of music.
Okay. No, I have not. I'm not an expert in policy, but I know these kids, and I know that workforce development, requiring them to work when they're in a state of flux, is very difficult for them. That's why we've developed a program called Star Works, where young people will have access to jobs on site within our facility. You know, they're coming to us inconsistently when they're in this transient state. They might come to the drop-in center at 10 o'clock on Tuesday and 2 o'clock on Thursday, but they're coming to us, and while they're there, they'll have access to work opportunities, trauma-informed workforce development. This trauma piece is crucial for these youth. We have young people who are getting jobs, and then one young man 5 hours in got into this perceived conflict with his boss. The fight or flight reflex kicked in, and he left. So this training will teach them to stay. Work is important, but it needs to be flexible.
And Mr. Turner has a bill that, again, I think is going to move, that gives foster youth a priority placement, one of the top three as they move out of foster care. My time is up, Mr. Lynn, but I was fascinated by your testimony and the issues that are happening in LA. Wasn't sure if this was people coming from where Duana and I live, where it's cold, coming to LA, but it seems like no. This is an issue of income. It's an issue of expensive housing. Prosecutors, maybe in your area. I'm sorry that I don't have more time, but I'm fascinated to hear more as we go through our witnesses to hear about your problems and how we find solutions to address your concerns. With that, my time is up. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and let me thank again Mr. Peter Lynn for being here. And of course, his testimony to us should shock us all. With the 55,188 people experiencing homelessness in the Los Angeles area. And of course, each time I visit downtown Los Angeles area, commonly referred to as Skid Row, I can see the expansion and the growth in the homeless population. And it seems to me that the tenting and the shanties and the shacks that are there housing people almost all the way up to City Hall. And so I am very, very concerned about this situation in Los Angeles, but I'm very pleased about the work that has been done. And I'm very pleased that the people of the city and the county voted to tax themselves in order to, not only increase housing, build housing, but supportive housing. So they're certainly to be commended for that. And I think a lot of cities need to think about what they can do in order to reduce homelessness in their areas by asking the taxpayers to please participate even more in ensuring that we could get people off the street. Now, let me just say, I had a visit this morning from the mayor of Oakland, Mayor Libby Schaaf, and she was here because they have a program where mayors and CEOs of companies are getting together to deal with homelessness, and I guess it's getting resources from both the public and the private sector. And so her question to me was, what can we do to get the federal government to provide more resources to deal with this issue. And I had to admit that I was absolutely troubled by the fact that this administration's funding budget for 2019 requests for cutting the Department of Housing and Urban Development's funding by $11 billion, including the elimination of at least 200,000 housing vouchers, the National Housing Trust Fund, the public housing, as well as many other critical housing programs. Can you basically talk about what this would mean for your efforts to reduce homelessness in Los Angeles? I could ask everybody on this panel this question, but you know, I was almost terribly embarrassed by the question when it was raised to me by the mayor of Oakland. What can you do when I'm facing these kind of cuts in the federal budget? How would this impact your efforts in our city? Mr. Lynn.
Ranking Member Waters, it would be devastating. Nationally and locally, it's devastating. These are folks, the overwhelming majority of people who are on the Housing Choice Voucher Program, colloquially Section 8, are extremely low income. That's 30% of area median or below. These are folks who would not be able to participate in the rental market at any level without assistance, without subsidy and assistance. It would mean a shrinkage of the affordability nationally. We have not kept pace with poverty and the population in this country since the program was initiated in the 70s. It has continued to shrink effectively compared to the number of people in America and the number of people in poverty in America. It is one of the primary bulwarks against homelessness is these deep affordable programs, Section 8 being one of them, public housing being another. Not funding operating reserves and capital improvements for public housing also erodes that housing stock, which covers the same depth of affordability. But the Housing Choice Voucher Program is the one that primarily allows people to move out into communities and move their kids closer to schools that they want to participate in, move them closer to work that they need, to the jobs that they want. It is the one that allows people who are in those extremely low-income categories to get integrated into community and keep from homelessness. It would be devastating.
As you can see, there needs to be every effort that can be made by those who are working to try and deal with this homeless problem, whether it's elected officials, community leaders, et cetera, to see what can be done, to speak with this administration, to speak with Ben Carson over at HUD, to see what can be done to convince them, please do not eliminate any housing vouchers. We need more. We have people who've been standing in line for these vouchers for years. And to talk about, cuts in the Department of Housing and Urban Development and in the elimination of these housing vouchers, we create more pain for everybody. And we just need to keep saying over and over again, federal government, administration, HUD, please help with this problem in real ways. Enough talking about it. We got to do something, and that do something is money and resources. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses today for your passion and for your service. It is clearly more than a livelihood for you. It is a labor of love, and I appreciate your service, especially with those involving the homelessness of children and a permanent solution for that. My first concern has to do with the competitiveness of the Continuum of Care grant program. One of the program priorities articulated by HUD has been the Housing First approach, which focuses on providing immediate access to housing, prioritizing providers that offer services to clients on a voluntary basis rather than on those programs that require sobriety or participation in education, work training, or service programs. Under the policy, HUD gives considerable preference based on the program's commitment to using the Housing First model, placing programs that do not use that model at a severe disadvantage in competition for federal dollars. For example, in my district in Central Florida, this shift has led to some of our most successful results-oriented programs being unable to secure financial support from HUD. So my question to each of you would be, briefly provide your thoughts on HUD's prioritization of programs that use the Housing First model. Is the scoring bonus for those programs warranted? What have been the results that you've noticed? And what are the potential downsides of this Housing First policy? And I'll start off with you, Ms. Roman.
The way I see the Housing First model and the way I think it works is that people have a difficult time addressing the very serious problems that they have if they're not in housing. It's just the treatment doesn't work very well, the services don't work very well, so it just seems to work much better to get people into housing first and then try to engage them in services and make services available. Sometimes people don't take them, but if the services are what people need, eventually they do tend to take them. So from my perspective, we have seen better outcomes as a result of taking that approach.
Ms. Bremer?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I actually direct 2 different programs. One is a zero tolerance program, and one is a harm reduction model. And I morally really struggled with our zero tolerance model because I felt I'm looking at someone and saying, you need to follow my precious rules or I'm not going to help you. I think getting...
Let me ask you, is that a result, do you run into many that don't want to help themselves? Or because it is difficult. I mean, I understand the need for the housing. I have no question about it. But also, at some point, if we're going to make this, as each one of you have talked about, a transition to a permanent solution of homelessness, they have to be gaining some sort of self-sufficiency. And if we can't provide those programs because of the Housing First competitive nature, we put them in Housing First and not look at the other programs. How do we resolve that conflict?
And I do totally agree with that. I think there can be 2 types of programs. One thing is we look at it at our shelter is we will take anyone in, but I look at that as an opportunity. That gives me an opportunity not to just say, let's get you into housing immediately. Maybe treatment might be a better option.
Right.
Maybe we can work with that individual to secure and meet some of their mental health needs. The one thing with housing is that is one thing that then the individual does not need to worry about.
I understand.
And that's one thing that we can help them with. But we can't lose one opportunity to try to get somebody into treatment, to try to get them to be in compliance with their mental health meds, because those are some of the major issues that we're also dealing with.
Gotcha. Mr. Lynn, in 30 seconds or less?
I think the data is overwhelmingly supportive of the Housing First model as the most effective, and I think that's what we really have to listen to. Study after study demonstrates that it's more effective in housing people and more effective in keeping people housed, and I think that's what HUD is really focused on. They've used the data that's available to us to drive this model. I think it's really important to recognize that housing is the linchpin resource. It is the one that allows you to rest, close the door, collect your thoughts, collect yourself, and get yourself connected to these other resources. If you lose your housing because you're unable to maintain sobriety, which is very common, right. Substance abuse has an extremely high recidivism rate. It is really hard to do. So when you lose your housing because you recidivate, it puts you back in a cycle of homelessness and keeps you there. Housing First has demonstrated its effectiveness, and that's why it's
Thank you. Ms. Bischoff, as much as I'd like to ask you, I think my time's expired, so.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, the ranking member, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to do this quickly. I made some comments similar to these in another hearing on what happens after some kind of a disaster, some major event. But when I was elected 14 years ago, my wife and I tried to get a house not too far from here, and we were warned that the neighborhood was too bad, but we could at least afford the house down there. Fast forward now, I can't afford to buy a house down there. They have the Nationals play baseball down there. There are about 50 upscale restaurants and new apartments, new grocery stores. I can't afford to live there. There are 179 census tracts in Washington, D.C. 60 of them have already been ruled as gentrified. 60, and they're growing. I've always wondered, where are those people who live down there? Where are they living now? And the area where they can live is narrowing inside the corporate city limits of D.C. So what happens is that if you're making $7.25 an hour and you're getting up every morning going to work, and you can't afford to buy an affordable house, you're going to end up homeless. And people will say, well, you don't want to work. Well, if you're making $7.25 an hour, that's about $15,000 a year, and you're going to struggle, and you are essentially homeless in this town. And it's moving all across the country, the same issue. We don't have enough affordable housing. So I think the whole issue of homelessness is compounded by, we got people with mental problems. That's just the reality. Then you have people now who may be getting up every morning and going to McDonald's and still they're homeless. They can't make enough money. And the housing in this city is extremely costly. So this is a profoundly disturbing issue for me. I would like for you guys to fix it in the next 2 minutes, 50 seconds. Ms. Romans, anybody, please help.
You're absolutely right. There's an affordable housing issue all across our nation. In Columbus, Ohio, our approach as part of our strategic plan is called Community First, based on a model in Austin, Texas, a village there that encompasses the 4 pillars of stability all on one site. You have affordable housing where youth would be paying 20% of their income to live there in either micro homes or efficiency apartments. There would be employment on site available for them, and transportation, the 4th pillar of stability, as well as social connections. A quarter of the 200 homes on the site would be set aside for mentors and staff who choose to live on site and abide by the purpose of this property, which is to lift youth up. And we believe that this could change lives.
Affordable housing is the issue, and we're not going to rapidly build our way out of that. And I would just say, with respect to the homelessness situation, right now the continuum of care programs are pretty much full. And if an organization wants to innovate around housing solutions, which I think we do need to be doing some of, more sharing of housing to keep costs down, different kinds of structure, housing configurations for people who have active substance abuse disorders and so forth. They really can't take the risk because they might, because of how tight the continuum is. So I would suggest one thing that would be good to do would be to have an innovation fund in the continuum of care, so that communities like those we have on the panel here could experiment with some different models that would help us address these housing concerns in the short term.
I'd like to add one thing to what Ann had said. We had done a test model, and it's very small scale, but it's a house. We placed 3 unrelated individuals there because they could not secure any other housing. Together, it's very affordable. They each have their own rooms. They share a kitchen and a living room. So those are some of the innovative ways that we would like to work with individuals in our community to maintain housing.
I think also at the federal level, affordable housing programs have been cut dramatically over the last several years. So the Community Development Block Grant Program and the Home Program have both suffered really dramatic cuts. I know in Los Angeles County, the decline was about 35% between 2009 and 2016. So those programs go right to the core of what needs to happen, which is construction of affordable housing. And those things are, they're, as Nan pointed out, it's not something you can fix quickly. We need construction, we need units to keep up with households, and we need units of affordability to keep up with households in poverty. And those things need to work together. We need to, on a national level.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holgren, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy. Thank you all so much for being here. Appreciate your work. I'm going to address my first questions to Ms. Bremer, if I may. First, thank you. I'm a huge fan of the Salvation Army and the amazing work the Salvation Army does, certainly in Chicago, but all over the country, an incredible history there. So just want to thank you for your work. Your testimony mentions that rural areas have unique challenges to addressing homelessness. My district, which is just west of Chicago, it includes western suburbs, but also some rural areas. So I'm sure that there are different challenges that what many people struggling with homelessness are encountering in more urban areas like downtown Chicago, just 30, 40, 50 miles away from most parts in my district. I wonder if you could describe some of the unique challenges for addressing homelessness that are faced in rural areas. And then are there certain solutions or services that are most effective at addressing homelessness in rural areas opposed to more urban areas? And what do you think Congress ought to do to better address homelessness in rural areas?
I think one of the main issues with rural areas with homelessness also is lack of transportation. All the distances are far. I was explaining to someone that for me, we've got clients that are on permanent supportive housing right now. Sometimes a case manager has to drive 1 hour to get to an appointment to see another client. We have a very minimal lack of public transportation, and I think that is the largest obstacle. When you start looking at centralized intake, which is an excellent model, but when you've got one centralized intake in the middle of the county and it's 30 or 40 miles to get there, that makes that obstacle very difficult. Doing a lot more things electronically, having a lot of different agencies have the same centralized intake information so people don't have to be asked the same question after question, that would be totally beneficial. I really like the prioritization that we're having so that we are serving the most vulnerable in our population first. But again, I just have to go back to transportation.
Thanks. Ms. Roman, your testimony, you also mentioned that homelessness has been going down faster in rural areas than in urban areas. Why do you believe this is the case, and what steps can be taken to get closer to eliminating homelessness in rural areas?
Well, I would agree that flexibility in rural areas is really the key, and you know, I don't think it's actually a definitional issue so much there as that, you know, if somebody becomes homeless and there's not a shelter bed, so they're staying on someone's couch, that they're still homeless, but they might not get counted that way. So I just think rural communities need more flexibility to address the needs individually, and these transportation needs as well, which it may be that a transportation solution would solve the problem. As to why the number is going down, I'm not sure why the number is going down, but I do think that rural communities have some advantages. They have lower numbers. They tend more to be less tolerant of long-term homelessness and to act more quickly to resolve the situation. Also, a lot of resources come to rural counties, and that allows the county itself to use the homeless resources in combination with TANF and housing, mental health, and other things, and just coordinate a little better. I mean, I actually think we could end homelessness in rural areas pretty quickly, much faster than we could in urban areas if we just had some adjustments to our approach.
Love to see that. Ms. Bischoff, if I can address my last minute to you, thank you first for all that you are doing and everyone there at Star House is doing to address youth homelessness. I absolutely agree that providing the support necessary to help individuals and families find and maintain a job is key. I also appreciate the real-life examples you shared in written testimony from the young man who lost his housing because his roommate could not pay his share of rent to simply providing a reliable place to shower for another young man before he went to his job at the mall. I wonder if you could discuss why the services that you offer under the McKinley-Vento Act are successful, and are there any improvements that you'd recommend to helping address youth homelessness? Specifically, how can we help provide stable employment and other opportunities for self-sufficiency?
Representative, thank you for the question. Our services are successful because we are research-based. We started out as a research project at OSU, and the research, one of the primary findings is that social connections were the greatest predictors of exiting homelessness. And I think in our programming, we too often take those connections lightly. So at Star House, young people come in through the provision of basic needs. We're really in the business of developing strong relationships with them. We know them individually, not just on paper. That's why we have so many stories to tell. Through this relationship building, then we connect them with easy access on one site, therapy, housing connections, jobs, education, For youth, we have to make the access to resources more flexible and more accessible.
Thank you all. My time's expired. I yield back, Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. McEwen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. And thank you all for being here this afternoon and for your insight. Since the 2008 economic recession, thousands of Nevada families have been struggling to maintain access to safe and affordable housing, as it's been alluded to here with the rest of the country. I represent the 4th Congressional District based out of Las Vegas, North Las Vegas, and Central Nevada. It was the epicenter of the housing crisis during the recession. And thousands of Nevadans lost their homes, and many were pushed into that rental market. Today, we're facing a severe shortage of rental homes, as we're hearing here today, that are affordable and available to people with the lowest incomes. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, there are only 15 affordable homes for every 100 extremely low-income families. Without affordable housing options, people live just one event, a car repair, an illness, from destabilizing impact of evictions, and in worst cases, homelessness. So unfortunately, this cycle is playing out in Southern Nevada, where we are experiencing a growing homeless population. Today, Las Vegas is one of the top 10 cities in America with the highest homeless population, and even more alarming, it is one of the fastest growing youth homeless populations in the country. So with that, I have a couple of questions, and I'll start with the homeless youth for Ms., and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name, Bischoff? So nearly half of homeless youth have been in juvenile detention, jail, or prison. Can you talk about the relationship between our system of criminal justice and homelessness? And secondly, what barriers exist for youth with criminal backgrounds?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Representative. Our youth are caught in a situation too often where they engage in survival crimes. We have a young man recently, he grew up in an orphanage in Russia, moved to Ohio, and has this lack of understanding for trusting connections. So he is often finding himself on the streets. He's not really able to couch surf because of that relational issue, and he finds himself in prison or jail often as a result. So for him, the challenge is very strong. I think coming out of prison, being able to find housing in such a way where you're not evicted is also another barrier that they face. So we do need to pay more attention to youth aging out of care and youth aging out of juvenile justice to ensure that they have the relationships and connections in their lives to sustain that housing, employment, and other stabilizing features as they go forward.
Thank you. And Mr. Lin, also a question for you as well. The Trump administration has proposed significant rent increases for families receiving federal rental assistance. What would this proposal mean for your efforts to reduce homelessness? And do you have any reason to believe that this proposal will help families becoming more self-sufficient?
We don't. One of the concerns we have is that the families that would be subject to these increases for rent are the poorest Angelino families. They are across the nation. They're the poorest folks that we offer assistance to. So an increase that might sound like an unmanageable increase to a family that's at median income or above, like $100, is absolutely devastating to somebody for whom that's most of their income for that month. There are a lot of households that are existing at severely poverty levels. And I think the one thing that we really would want to underscore is that these have profound impacts on people who are the least able to afford them. I don't think work requirements are the best approach to people experiencing poverty. I think that providing opportunities for people to engage in workforce development is critical and is very, very important. But certainly work requirements can push people into homelessness. And the rent increases for the poorest folks is a very, 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 very poor use of this resource.
Right. Thank you. And last question, Ms. Roman, I'm sorry. In your experience, what are the biggest myths or misunderstandings about homelessness that you have had to confront, and how are you sought to change public perception on those fronts?
Well, I think probably the biggest myth is that everybody has mental illness and substance abuse, and once they become homeless, they stay homeless forever, basically, until they're given a subsidy, and that's not true. Most people don't have mental health and substance abuse disorders, although those are overrepresented in the population. And most people who become homeless self-resolve. They enter the homeless system, they figure something out, they leave, and they don't come back. So really, who stays longer is the people with more serious problems. How we seek to clarify that to people, we do communications and public information, and we rely also on you all understanding it and explaining it to the constituents as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you holding this hearing. And my first question is for Ms. Bischoff. Ms. Bischoff, welcome. It's great to have you here. There are a lot of young folks that are, because of the definition of homelessness at HUD, they are denied a safe place to stay. And they're left to rely on the goodwill of family, friends, and neighbors, or live out of hotels or motels. And my first question is, do you think that a child living in those type of conditions, either relying on the goodwill of extended family, friends, or neighbors, or living out of motels, is disadvantaged when it comes to education and health outcomes? And can you explain what that means?
Representative, thank you for the question. Absolutely, they are at a disadvantage. We know that this population is 12 times more likely to die, period, than their peers who are not homeless. I work with young people who are living on the streets, sleeping in tents, sleeping on the proverbial park bench, and sleeping outside in the elements. The #1 killer of this population is suicide and overdose because of a lack of hope for the future. So healthcare is certainly important. That's why we have a health clinic on site at Star House, so that they can have immediate access to those services. In terms of workforce, getting to their place of employment becomes very difficult when they're living on the north side of town one night and the east side of town the next. They are getting jobs, as our research has shown, as I shared, but keeping those jobs becomes impossible. So we need flexible opportunities for them where they have access to trauma-informed workforce care, workforce development that is in sync with the jobs that are offered.
Thank you for that. So as a follow-up, are these young folks, these children growing up in those conditions of relying on the goodwill of extended family, friends, or neighbors, or living out of motels, more likely to experience unemployment or homelessness as adults?
Yes, and our research shows that the longer a young person experiences the transience of homelessness by any definition, including those couch surfers, the more difficult it becomes for them to exit street life. So utilizing the McKinney-Vento Education Act, which includes those youth who are couch surfing, it allows us to assist all youth living without a permanent place to call home before they become chronically homeless, and the return on investment over the course of a lifetime will be exponential.
Thank you, Ms. Bischoff. You also talked about how hard it is for them to get to employment when they don't know where they're going to live. What about getting to a school?
We have several youth at Star House who are currently enrolled in college. I think that's something that people don't realize.
Right.
They've graduated from high school, they enroll, but when they're in survival mode, they're going to choose food and other basic needs over college, and they withdraw, and then they have debt, and there's a cycle of issues. So certainly we need flexible opportunities of all kind. At Star House, in our strategic plan, as we develop this village, on site, we want college, community college opportunities for them that are virtual and flexible so that they can move forward toward stability.
Thank you. I think, obviously, I know there's some people concerned about resources, but we have to figure out how to take care of these children. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I will tell you, a lot of us will stand up for more resources, but we've got to get a definition that helps us get a count so we know what kind of resources to get. And that's why this bill is so, so important. Thank you so much. My next question is about our veteran homelessness, and I will ask Ms. Bremer, I guess. Is there anybody who wants a question on veteran homelessness? prefers it. Mr. Lin, do you look excited? Would you like it, Mr. Lin? Okay. Well, why don't I give you the question, and whoever wants to talk about it can. So we have seen a huge drop in veteran homelessness, except among a special population. That's the population of veterans who either don't qualify under the definition of veteran as a result of serving in the reserve as opposed to the active duty, or those who have discharges with other than honorable conditions. Let me start with a simple question. Do any of you think that somebody should be sentenced to a life of homelessness simply because their discharge is an other than honorable discharge?
No one should be homeless.
Thank you. Is that a problem you're seeing in your organizations, and do you believe that we should do something to address this special population of folks and try to make sure they get resources? They don't qualify for the HUD-VASH program because of the definition of veteran and their designation of service. But do you believe that we should try to do something to find a special assistance for that population?
I think that the question, the way you framed it, really illustrates how effective resources are. This program, the HUD-VASH program, the Supportive Services for Veteran Families program together have driven homeless veteran numbers so far down.
Close to zero.
We would never have predicted that we could be so effective at this challenge of ending veteran homelessness before we put the resources in. You put the resources in, they really talk. It goes back to the
in Central Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio, 24 veterans were that close every night. And some nights were like 5 or 6 veterans, but we've never had more than 26, and almost everyone are in that special population we just talked about.
So resources matter. Finding resources to fit the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness, whether they're other than honorably discharged veterans, whether they're people who have never served and are chronically homeless, whether they're youth, we need resources for everyone experiencing homelessness. Resources matter. That's why there's a challenge with the youth definition. If we don't put the resources behind it, we don't know how many kids are in that definition, but there are a lot more.
But let's not make those kids suffer until we figure it out, sir.
So the resources behind it, we can use them. We know how to deploy them.
I'm a minute and 48 seconds over my time, and the chairman's sort of been very generous. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the answer, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velazquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Roman, earlier this week, the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development released their draft spending bill for FY 2019. The bill provides $3.6 million to U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which President Trump sought to eliminate in his FY 2019 budget request. Can you speak to the important role the Council plays? How will these additional resources help the Council combat homelessness nationwide?
So the federal government spends about $5 billion a year on homelessness from a variety of different agencies, 5 or 6 major agencies. And I think the investment of $3.6 million to coordinate those federal agencies, investment of $5 billion, not to mention all the work that USICH does with communities around the country and spreading best practices to them and states, is well worth the investment. And I think that coordination, which it's very hard for the programs to do, they do it, but they do, it's extra work, and they're trying to run the programs effectively. It makes a huge difference, and it's a big reason why our numbers are going down.
Thank you. Ms. Roman, in his budget request, the President reduces funding for the Section 8 program, requesting approximately $19.3 billion, or $977 million less than FY 2017 enacted levels. Under the budget, the President's request, New York City will lose approximately 15,000 Section 8 vouchers, and more than 200,000 housing vouchers will be lost nationwide. With more than 200,000 fewer vouchers, how will HUD be able to address homelessness and housing poverty? And by the way, you mentioned the misconception of mental health and substance abuse, but what about the other misconception that homeless people don't work? In places like New York, where we have 63,000 homeless people, they are the working poor in many instances. The problem there is we don't have enough affordable housing, and there are not much resources put into building new housing programs that will provide affordable housing.
Yes, of course. So if the budget proposal goes through, I mean, the result will be that more people will become homeless and fewer people will exit homelessness. And this is not a wise, however you may feel about that, this is not a wise decision for the country economically, morally, socially, because letting people be homeless has a tremendous cost to us in all of those areas.
Mr. Lin, would you like to comment?
As I indicated earlier, I think the voucher program is one of the backbones of affordability for the poorest Americans, and I think that any cuts to it, the program has eroded over time with regard to its reach into the population of need. It needs to be expanded. The last thing we need is to erode the size and scope of this program.
What about your take on the CDBG program? In New York City, the CDBG program allowed the city to provide emergency shelter to 1,000 households in 2016. Can any of you discuss the importance of the CDBG program in combating homelessness?
We use it very effectively in Los Angeles, and the city and county of Los Angeles both contribute CDBG funds into addressing homelessness, both through development of affordable housing, through provision of shelter, through other services. I think communities, nationally have used it to address affordability issues that directly prevent homelessness. It has a lot of flexibility and is used to address homelessness, both preventing people from falling into it by contributing to the affordability in communities, and also by direct provision of services for people experiencing homelessness. Very important program.
I would just add it also often pays for the city staff to coordinate the homeless assistance locally.
Well, let me just say that I'm so happy to see that the bipartisan THUD appropriations draft that was released, this bill, is a clear repudiation of the President's budget request of 2019, and I'm happy to see that. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss. Actually, I withdraw that. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Roman, as you know, Ranking Member Maxine Water and I, along with Representative Stivers and Joyce Beatty, have introduced the Working Together to End Homelessness Act, which continues the authorization of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. In your testimony, you noted the role that the Council plays in coordinating federal agencies to enhance performance, to improve outcomes. Given the urgency here surrounding, and across the country, surrounding this issue of the opioid crisis, can you speak to the Council's role in aiding federal and local agencies with respect to the intersection of that crisis and homelessness?
Yes, thank you for the question. The impact of opioids on homelessness varies. In some places it's a big factor, in other places it's not, but it's obviously very key. USICH pulled together an interagency working group on opioids to align federal efforts around the impact on homelessness and provide guidance. The USICH regional coordinators are working with communities on key strategies to address opioid use in homeless populations and help to stop that. They have identified housing providers that are housing people who have got opioid use disorders and shared those successful practices. They have instituted peer-to-peer learning and are providing written guidance to communities. So they really have led the effort to help homeless assistance organizations and systems to understand what the best practices that we know of to help people deal with opioid.
Well, thank you, Nan. Any of the other members of the panel want to add any specifics in terms of your communities? And
I think the opioid crisis draws out one of the key benefits of USICH, which is their ability to coordinate between federal agencies. So you have substance abuse treatment and strategies that are deployed through Health and Human Services, combined with the work that's going on with the homeless assistance grants that come through HUD and through other federal agencies. And I think the coordination role is critical. But
can you just give me an example, Mr. Lind, of how you do that in LA, how that?
Well, so in Los Angeles on the local level, we have the Department of Public Health, which is our local substance abuse prevention and control agency, working closely with the continuum of care. So we have deployed beds to address people with substance abuse issues. The opioid crisis not hit LA as hard as it's hit many other regions. So, but we do work very closely to ensure that there are substance abuse treatment beds available through the continuum and through the connection that people experiencing homelessness have to the rest of the resources. That kind of coordination is essentially what, those are the practices that are elevated up by USICH and can present a model of effectiveness to other communities. Los Angeles has a deep bench, many communities don't, and the work that USICH does in terms of elevating what are best practices is critical to those communities that just don't have the same resource base or the depth of research.
President Reagan said that integrity and efficiency in managing government programs not only save the government money, they mean better service for those the programs are designed to serve. They mean better service for the people. So, Nan, you testified that the Interagency Council on Homelessness, the budget there is a very modest sum, especially considering the scale of the targeted resources, for ending homelessness. In line with the former president's maxim, would you say that the council plays a role in improving the efficiency of the administration of these resources? And if so, could you just give us a quick example?
It absolutely does that. A good example might be the HUD-VASH program. So that's an incredibly effective program, as people have discussed already today, that provides vouchers from HUD and combines them with services from VA. You might think that's pretty straightforward and easy to administer, but in the process of implementing that, there have been so many decisions that had to be made that just weren't really happening. Who was eligible for the assistance, who decided who was the next person, what kinds of services, what was the case management ratio, who did the outreach, and really those decisions weren't getting made until USICH stepped in and coordinated that. And now that program's functioning at a high level.
Thank you very much, Nan. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the ranking member as well and the witnesses for appearing today. I have been provided some intelligence, some information from staffers, and I bothered to try to validate it because it's something that is difficult to comprehend. And I've checked several sources, and most of the sources are close. Numbers may vary slightly, but the intelligence indicates that African Americans are about 12, maybe 12.5, under 13% of the population, yet they represent more than 40% of the homeless population. 12.5%, under 13%, total population, 40% of the homeless population. Can someone explain to me why we have this disparity, please?
I think it's really impossible to address that topic without confronting America's history of racial
I have
segregation and
3 minutes and 31 seconds, and confront it to the extent that you can, please.
Sir, if you look at African Americans in the county of Los Angeles, they comprise about 8% of the population. If you look at people in poverty in the county of Los Angeles, they comprise about 12%. So right there you have a dramatic overrepresentation of people who are very, very poor. But if you look at people experiencing homelessness, the representation is 40%, which is 5 times the general population. And I think that there is intersectionality with housing discrimination. I think there is intersectionality with job discrimination. But I would, if I had to put my finger on one thing, it would probably be criminal justice engagement and disproportionate impacts of inequitable criminal justice enforcement. If you look at the population of the jails in Los Angeles County, they're 30% African American. So these things stack. Once you're incarcerated, you have a much harder time economically for the future. It's harder to get a job, it's harder to keep a job, it's harder to get housing, it's harder to keep housing. It's harder to maintain the social connections that Ms. Bischoff was talking about that are so vital to people. It interrupts every pattern that folks have. I think that's one of the strongest predictors of homelessness. But the overrepresentation of African Americans in homelessness, I think, says volumes about the challenges that African Americans are facing across systems in America.
Yes, ma'am, if you would,
I just would concur. I would say, you know, the overrepresentation of African Americans in the poor population, housing discrimination, and then the feeder systems. So corrections is one, but foster care is another big one that are sending people in. I think what we don't know is whether the homeless system, which is on the receiving end of that disproportionality, itself is having a disparate impact on the population, and that's something that that we're planning to look at in the next year at the Alliance.
please. Others?
So in Los Angeles,
you've given me an answer that I'd just like to hear from the other members of the panel, please. Just give me your opinions. I'd like to hear your opinions.
Representative, thank you for the question. I concur with Mr. Lynn and Nan. I know at Star House, about 60% of the youth there are African American. It's a little bit more than what you would see in the shelter. We attribute part of that to the young women in our program being more likely to be accepted into someone's home as a couch surfer, and these young men are not always welcome in the home of folks within their community. I agree with Nan in terms of the systems that they're more likely to go into.
Yes, ma'am, please.
And I do agree with incarceration. That is a huge problem for the folks that we work with. Once you're incarcerated, you've got that on your record, it becomes extremely difficult to secure any type of permanent housing.
Well, my time is up. I'll have a follow-up question when I have the next opportunity to visit. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the panel for being with us this afternoon and to the work you're doing in a very critical area for our country and in your respective communities. Ms. Bramer, you mentioned in your testimony that mental illness and substance abuse are primary causes of homelessness for single adults in your region. As you may know, the opioid crisis has been devastating in Western Pennsylvania as well. One of my main priorities is making sure that our resources are effectively deployed to do their best possible work to help those suffering from addiction get clean, get back to work, and return to stable, fulfilling, and independent lives. What can Congress do to give local providers the tools to address this multifaceted problem?
Additional funds for treatment facilities would be extremely beneficial. In the rural area that I'm in, we're seeing more meth addiction than any other addictions. Additionally, the burden on foster care. At our shelter, and keep in mind, we're in rural Wisconsin, at one given day, one of the communities had taken 14 children into custody because of meth use. And the scary part is many of the parents would be willing to go into treatment, but there is a lack of services for one, and then they worry about what's going to happen to their children.
Any regulatory restrictions that would limit your flexibility to be dealing with this issue?
Not so much. I mean, again, I think I'm looking at what we're looking at is additional funding.
Yeah. Okay. I think another new $1 billion is going to be made available this coming September on treatment programs. Ms. Bischoff, in your testimony, you wrote that all agencies need the freedom to grow and try new concepts to lift youth who do not have a permanent home out of homelessness. Representative Stivers had a line of questions. He raised the definition of homelessness. Given what Representative Stivers has been talking about with his legislation, has HUD given solving youth homelessness the priority it deserves, do you think?
Representative, thank you for the question. I think HUD is beginning to recognize the need. They've recognized the drop-in center model as an important piece of the puzzle. They're also part of the 100-day challenge that's been going on, and an effort of the Committee to Address Youth Homelessness across the nation. So I would say that we're all beginning to learn more about the population, why they're hiding, and how to bring them in.
Ms. Roman, I understand that veteran homelessness, again, this is an issue that Representative Stivers brought up, has fallen significantly in recent years. How can we apply what we learned in the fight to reduce veteran homelessness to interventions targeted at other subgroups, whether it's young people, families, and those suffering from drug addiction and mental illness?
Well, I really think the reason for success in the veteran arena is because we had the key tools that we needed in terms of interventions. That was permanent supportive housing for high-need people and rapid rehousing for lower-need people, and also some emergency assistance. And really, there was a tremendous political will around it, and the resources were scaled to the size of the problem. Mm-hmm. And that's what allowed us to make that progress there, and so rapidly.
Mr. Lind, your testimony details LA's homelessness crisis as a, quote, crisis of housing affordability. Other high-cost cities, all with housing affordability problems on their own, they don't seem to have the homelessness epidemic that LA has. What makes LA different from other high-cost areas around the country?
So I think part of the issue is just scale. You have to remember Los Angeles County has over 10 million residents. It is the most populous county in America, and is actually, if it were a state, it would be the 9th largest state. So it's very, very big. And I think that we do not have the sort of per capita homelessness that some other communities do, but from the scale of how big Los Angeles is. So housing affordability is a key driver, but we have the same challenges that many other communities face. There are a significant plurality of people with serious mental illness. There are a significant plurality of people who face substance abuse issues. We have been working to integrate discharge from our foster system into the homelessness planning, and that work is going to be instrumental in preventing homelessness. But I think that many of the drivers that we've seen across the country also affect Angelenos at a much larger scale.
One of the things in your testimony, you said homelessness in LA did not arise overnight or over a few years, but as a result of many policy choices we have made both federally and at the local level. I'm wondering, have local zoning laws contributed to housing affordability in Los Angeles?
I think that it would be hard to argue otherwise. Certainly, housing unit production has not kept up with households in Los Angeles County, and that puts a real squeeze on affordability. That would do the same anywhere in the,
Any other local issues besides zoning that might be a factor? That reflecting in your testimony, you're talking about policy choices at the local level.
I think particularly land use issues are the key there.
Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Between 2009 and 2016, federal funding for affordable housing in Los Angeles County declined 35%. That is certainly one of the reasons why we've seen this huge increase in homelessness, but another, as Mr. Lind points out, is just the incredible cost of building a new apartment unit. Given the very high fees that local government impose on each unit, and given the high costs of land, and given the fact that you're strictly limited as to how many units you can put on a piece of land. Mr. Lynn, what would be the impact of the administration's rent reform and work requirements, the so-called Making Affordable Housing Work Act, on homelessness in the Los Angeles area? Would this initiative help the city serve more people, or would it exacerbate the problem?
I think it would clearly exacerbate the problem. I think the concern that we have in raising minimum rents for people who are the poorest housed folks that are in Los Angeles is of grave concern, very concerning. The impact of work requirements on households, particularly families with children, families with disabled members. I think it would only exacerbate the problem, sir.
Now, although Los Angeles County does have 10 million people, and New York has even more, although it's divided into several different counties, we see 1 in every 4 people experiencing homeless last year did so in New York City or Los Angeles. Is that because of the high cost of housing in those areas? Because it occurs to me that unemployment is a problem nationwide, addiction is nationwide, psychological and other health problems are nationwide, and yet we've got 1 in 4 people in those 2 cities. Is there something else that causes disproportionate homelessness in the 2 largest metropolitan areas that you can put your finger on, other than the very high cost of an apartment?
So I think high cost of living is the key issue. Both of those are very unaffordable communities, and the unemployment rate is actually quite low. We're experiencing quite a robust economy in the Los Angeles area. The challenge is that most of the jobs and most of the income has actually gone to above median income households. So what happens is, as the economy picks up, people have better paying jobs. Folks who are making minimum wage and people who are below minimum wage, who have fixed incomes, they're on benefits programs, they're on pensions, they feel an extreme squeeze as the rents increase, as people can pay more, and there's a fixed housing stock issue.
We in California need to build 180,000 units a year. We're a growing state. We're building 80,000. What can the city of Los Angeles do to bring down, to encourage people to build more apartments, condos, affordable housing, or even housing that somebody would move into, thereby vacating another unit that would be affordable? How do we get more housing built in Los Angeles?
So I think the city and the county are looking at this. One of the issues that has driven a lot of interest is the building of accessory dwelling units, which are generally as of right in most areas. And I think there's the ability to put a second unit on your lot, often called granny flats, or a second dwelling unit. I think that holds out a lot of promise. I think there's been a lot of work to address this concern and think through what is the impact of land use policy on constraining supply and to address
what fee is charged in Los Angeles per unit to pay for the infrastructure, the parks, et cetera, that's already there? Let's say you have the right to build a 5-unit, or I'll use a round number, 10-unit building. What's the city charge you for the right to do that?
I don't actually know, sir.
I mean, I've been given numbers.
I'll cover a lot of zones, but that one's a little far outside my zone, sir.
Okay, because I'm told figures of well over $100,000, whereas in most of the country, the cost of construction, land, everything per unit would be less than that. So I don't know if the figure is that high, but advocates for making it easier to build apartments are saying that it totals that.
I will find out and get back to you, sir.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I want to thank our panel for their testimony today. I would just note that you can see there's a bipartisan interest in trying to resolve these solutions, and both sides coming together to help the most disadvantaged among us in our communities, whether it's from LA to rural Wisconsin and anywhere in between to Ohio, is incredibly important. And I think you see a willingness from this committee to try to do the best we can And I just want to thank you for your insight and look forward to continuing to work with this panel and others as we navigate this important issue to make sure that we do the right thing as policymakers that can help the most folks in our communities. And so, again, thank you for your testimony and your time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to our witnesses. I would ask our witnesses, if possible, please respond as promptly as you are able. And without objection, this hearing is now adjourned.